The first thing you need to know is that smoke doesn't just rise. It drifts, curls, and lingers, especially when you're slow cooking a brisket for 16 hours. On that particular Saturday morning, the air above Willow Creek Estates shimmered with the golden haze of mesquite and hickory, rolling lazily over rooftops like some fragrant weather front. It was my pride and joy, the brick barbecue pit I'd spent years perfecting, stationed right at the edge of my property where the wind carried its magic across the valley. By noon, the smell had reached every cul-de-sac, every manicured lawn, and apparently, the delicate nostrils of the HOA president herself. You could almost set your watch by how fast they descended when something offended their precious community standards. And sure enough, there they were, golf carts lined up at the curb like a suburban cavalry, sun visors tilted low, clipboards in hand. When they knocked, I wiped my hands, stepped out from behind the pit, and there she was, Marlene Fisher, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of aesthetic purity, standing with 2 board members flanking her like a royal court. She didn't waste time. She pointed at my pit and handed me a crisp, official-looking notice. It said, in cold block letters, immediate removal required, violation of Section 14B, non-approved structures and nuisance smoke. I didn't argue. I didn't even speak. I just let the corner of my mouth curl into the smallest smile, walked inside, and pulled out a leather-bound folder that had been sitting in my safe for years. Inside was a piece of paper older than every single house in Willow Creek Estates. And it was about to become their worst nightmare. What they didn't know. That perfect little neighborhood, with its color-coordinated shutters and tennis outfit Karens patrolling in carts, wasn't just next to my property. It was my property, at least on paper. And I was about to remind them of that fact in a way they'd never forget. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, because you're about to witness the most satisfying HOA takedown involving barbecue smoke, dusty legal records, and a deed they never saw coming. My name's Travis Cole. 43 years old, 3rd-generation pitmaster, and more importantly for this story, 3rd-generation landowner in this part of Texas. My grandfather, Walter Cole, bought this land in 1962 when it was nothing but rolling pasture, scrub oaks, and cattle trails. He was the kind of man who could read soil like a book and measure a brisket's doneness by the way the smoke looked in the morning sun. In the early 80s, when developers started sniffing around, he sold them a portion of the land, or so they thought. Turns out, my grandfather was no fool. The sale came with stipulations, and thanks to an error in their own paperwork, the deed for the entire stretch of property where Willow Creek now sits was still tied up with my family's holdings. It was a quiet legal fluke, buried in county records, overlooked for decades. I'd known about it for years, but never had reason to bring it up. Until now. The Willow Creek HOA prided itself on its handbook, a 93-page binder full of rules written in the same tone as a tax audit, covering everything from mailbox paint color to acceptable shades of mulch. They operated like clockwork, one anonymous complaint, followed by a friendly notice, followed by fines that could ruin your week, month, or year. Most folks in the neighborhood bent the knee quickly. A warning about trash cans left out too long? Fixed by morning. A reminder about lawn height? Mowed that same afternoon. But me. I didn't live under their rules. My house sat just outside their official neighborhood, or so they thought. Which meant their jurisdiction didn't technically extend to me. Except Marlene didn't see it that way. To her, if you could see something from the neighborhood, it was fair game. And my barbecue pit was in full view from the back fence of 3 different properties. She'd probably been planning this little ambush for weeks. I still remember the way the leather creaked when I opened that folder, pulling out the yellow document inside. The 1962 deed, complete with my grandfather's signature and the notary's embossed seal. Right there in black and white was the boundary line, a line that ran straight through what was now Willow Creek Estates. Back in the day, it had been a mix-up between the developer and the county clerk's office. The developer built without properly securing full ownership, assuming no one would care enough to check. My grandfather never raised a fuss because, frankly, he didn't care, as long as they stayed neighborly. But now, that neighborliness was gone. And the deed in my hands was about to become the key to flipping the HOA's world upside down. I didn't rush. That's the thing about good barbecue, and good revenge. You let it simmer. You tend the fire. You wait until the timing is just right. Instead of confronting Marlene on the spot, I smiled, thanked her for the notice, and went back to tending the pit. Let her think she'd won round one. In reality, I was about to go nuclear, legally speaking. First, I called my buddy Clint, a real estate attorney who'd been itching for a good fight. Then, I gathered every scrap of paper related to the property, old maps, tax receipts, and the original transaction agreement. If the HOA wanted to play hardball over Smoke, I was going to bring the entire lumberyard. By sunset, the brisket was done, the pit was still standing, and my plan was in motion. The next morning, before the HOA could even draft their second warning, Clint filed a property claim with the county, citing ownership rights over the land the HOA's own office building sat on. It wasn't an eviction notice. Not yet. But it was enough to freeze them in place legally. And as word spread through the neighborhood, I noticed something funny. Some folks weren't angry at me. They were curious. A few even came over that afternoon, drawn in by the smell of smoked ribs, wanting to hear the story. And the more I told it, the more the idea took hold. Maybe this wasn't just about a barbecue pit. Maybe it was about taking back control from an HOA that had gotten way too big for its britches. The pit was still smoking when I got the first call from Marlene's legal representative. That was when I knew they were scared. And that's when I decided I wasn't just going to defend my barbecue pit. I was going to own their whole operation. The call from Marlene's legal representative wasn't exactly intimidating. The voice on the other end was shaky, as if reading from a hastily prepared script. They informed me that the HOA board would like to invite me to their next meeting to clarify any misunderstandings about my barbecue pit and my property rights. I almost laughed. I'd been to HOA meetings before, not theirs, but others. I knew exactly how they worked. They were more about control than clarity. The board sat at a long table like a tribunal, neighbors sat in plastic chairs lined up like school detention, and there was always that one member with a gavel who banged it every time someone got too passionate. This time, though, I wouldn't be there as a guest. I'd be there as the man holding the one piece of paper that could dismantle their entire operation. When I walked into the clubhouse the night of the meeting, every head in the room turned. The smell of chlorine from the community pool mixed with the faint aroma of fresh-baked cookies. Someone on the board was clearly trying to soften the mood. Marlene sat dead center at the table, flanked by her two loyal lieutenants. Her expression was a careful mix of authority and fake friendliness, the kind of smile you give someone when you're hoping they don't know how much trouble they could cause. The meeting opened with routine business, approving minutes, discussing lawn maintenance budgets, and reminding everyone about the upcoming neighborhood yard sale. I waited patiently, arms folded, leather folder in my lap. When my name finally came up, Marlene gestured for me to approach the microphone. I stood, walked slowly to the front, and opened the folder. The sound of the leather snapping open echoed in the otherwise quiet room. I placed the deed on the podium and slid it forward so the board could see it. This, I began, is the original property deed for the land Willow Creek Estates is built on. It's been in my family since 1962. According to county records, ownership has never fully transferred to the HOA or the developer before them. Which means that technically, you're all on my property. The room went silent. You could almost hear the mental gears grinding in the heads of every board member. Marlene's fake smile froze in place, and the man to her left started flipping through a binder as if the answers were hiding in the landscaping regulations. One of the board members finally spoke up, insisting that surely there had been a proper transfer, and that this must be some kind of misunderstanding. I simply shrugged. If that's the case, I said, then you won't mind me getting the county to verify it. And while they're at it, maybe they can check whether your office, tennis courts, and half your walking trail are technically on my land too. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of what I was saying did all the work. At this point, several of the residents in the audience began whispering to each other. I caught snippets. Wait, is he serious? And does that mean? Marlene tried to regain control, slamming her gavel down and declaring that this discussion would be moved to a private session. But before they could shuffle everyone out, I leaned into the microphone one last time. Oh, and for the record, I said, my barbecue pit isn't going anywhere. In fact, I'm planning a neighborhood cookout this weekend. You're all invited. Even you, Marlene. The ripple of laughter from the residents told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't alone in my frustration with this board. I left the meeting that night with more than just the upper hand. I had momentum. The HOA had just been publicly blindsided, and every resident who'd been silently annoyed by them now had a story to tell, and a person to rally behind. Over the next few days, things started shifting. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to in years stopped by to shake my hand, ask questions, and share their own HOA horror stories. Apparently, fines for faded shutters and non-compliant garden gnomes had been piling up for years. The barbecue pit was just the tip of the iceberg. Meanwhile, Clint, my attorney friend, began digging deeper. He pulled tax maps, old plat surveys, and transaction logs. Everything confirmed what we already knew. The HOA was standing on shaky legal ground. If they pushed too hard, they risked losing not just the fight over my pit, but their entire authority. That didn't stop them from trying. By the following week, I received another notice, this one claiming that the smoke from my barbecue was a public health hazard under some vague community guideline. I actually laughed out loud reading it. They were desperate. I called Clint, and we decided it was time to turn the screws. We drafted a formal letter to the HOA, informing them that until the deed issue was resolved, they had no legal jurisdiction over my property, and that continued harassment could be considered trespassing and grounds for a civil suit. We also included a friendly reminder that the clubhouse they held their meetings in sat on my land, and I had every right to restrict their access. When the letter was delivered, I imagined the panic in that office. I could see Marlene pacing in her pristine living room, phone glued to her ear, trying to figure out how to make this all go away without looking like she'd lost control. But the thing was, she had already lost control. The night before the cookout, I stood by the pit, trimming brisket and rubbing it down with my grandfather's spice mix, thinking about how quickly things had escalated. What started as an attempt to shut me down had turned into something bigger, a stand against an HOA that had overstepped its bounds for years. And as the first guests began to arrive the next day, carrying coolers and folding chairs, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning of the cookout dawned warm and bright, with that perfect late spring breeze that carried the scent of blooming magnolias, and, soon enough, the slow, mouth-watering aroma of smoked brisket. By 9 a.m., I had the pit running low and steady, just the way my grandfather taught me. Hickory wood popped and hissed in the firebox, sending a thin ribbon of smoke curling into the sky. By 11 a.m., that smoke had done more than flavor the meat. It had drawn a crowd. Neighbors wandered over in lawn chairs and baseball caps, their faces lit with anticipation. Some had brought homemade sides, others beer, and a few just came to watch the spectacle. But they all came knowing this wasn't just about food. This was about sending a message. From my spot at the grill, I could see the HOA clubhouse across the street. The blinds were drawn, but I knew they were watching. I half expected Marlene to come marching over, clipboard in hand, ready to shut us down. But she didn't. Not yet. The first wave of brisket sandwiches went out around noon, and with every bite, the mood shifted. People weren't just eating, they were talking. Stories about fines for mismatched curtains, letters about improper lawn edging, and threats over garden decor flowed as freely as the iced tea. I listened, nodded, and took mental notes. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was ours. By mid-afternoon, the cookout had doubled in size. Folks from 2 streets over showed up, drawn by the smell and the whispers. One neighbor, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Ellen, told me she'd lived here for 15 years and had never seen so many people gathered in one place without the HOA's permission. That's when Clint arrived. He strolled up in jeans, sunglasses, and a wide grin, carrying a manila envelope under his arm. He didn't even need to say it. I knew whatever was in that envelope was going to make Marlene's day much worse. "You've started a revolution," he said, handing me a soda. "And it's about to get more interesting." Inside the envelope was a series of aerial survey maps from the county archives. Clint had highlighted certain areas in bright yellow. The tennis courts, the pool, the walking trail, all technically on my property according to these old plats. And not just barely over the line, either. We were talking substantial overlap. I looked at him, half smiling. "So if I wanted to, I could lock the gates tomorrow?" "Legally," Clint said, sipping his drink. Yeah. Would it make you the neighborhood villain? Probably. But considering the HOA's reputation, you might just be the hero. The idea lodged itself in my mind like a glowing ember. I didn't plan to kick anyone out of the tennis courts or shut down the pool. Not yet. But the knowledge that I could, well, that was power. Around 2 p.m., the inevitable happened. A white golf cart rolled up, driven by one of the HOA's more notorious enforcers, a wiry man named Ted who always wore aviator sunglasses like he was auditioning for a police drama. He didn't get out right away, just sat there, scanning the crowd. Finally, he stepped out, clipboard in hand. "This gathering," he began, "has not been sanctioned by the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." I wiped my hands on a towel, walked over, and smiled. Good thing I'm not on Willow Creek property then. Ted's jaw tightened. "You're creating a nuisance. The smoke is delicious," I cut in. "Would you like a plate? On the house." The crowd behind me chuckled, and for the first time, I saw Ted falter. He mumbled something about further action and retreated to his cart, speeding back toward the clubhouse. I knew then the board would regroup, and soon. But every moment they delayed was a moment more people heard our side of the story. And with Clint's evidence in my back pocket, I was ready for their next move. By evening, the cookout had turned into a block party. Kids chased each other around the yard, someone set up a cornhole game, and an impromptu band formed with a guitar, a set of bongos, and a guy whistling harmony. I served until the meat was gone, and when the last plate was handed out, I stood back and watched my neighbors laughing and mingling like it was a community worth fighting for. That night, as I cleaned the pit, Clint stayed behind to talk strategy. "They're going to come after you harder now," he warned. "Probably through legal channels. But you've got something they don't, leverage. And from what I've seen today, you've also got the people." I thought about that as the last embers died out. The HOA might still have their rules and their fines, but I had something more dangerous to them: a united neighborhood, a paper trail of legal ownership, and a willingness to push back. The next morning, the retaliation began. A formal letter slid under my door accused me of violating community noise ordinances and operating an unlicensed event. It was absurd, and they knew it. But it was also a warning. They weren't backing down. I poured myself a cup of coffee, read the letter twice, and smiled. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. But it wouldn't be the kind of fight they were used to, where they could hide behind bylaws and half-truths. No, this would be a fight in broad daylight, where every resident could see exactly who they were and what they were doing. And the best part? I was just getting started. By the time the HOA's second letter arrived, the air in the neighborhood was thick with tension. You could feel it in the way people slowed their morning walks when they passed my property, in the hushed conversations exchanged over hedges, and in the sudden bursts of laughter that carried just a little too far. Everyone knew something was brewing. This new letter wasn't a complaint. It was an official notice of mandatory compliance hearing. They were summoning me to appear before the HOA board, to address ongoing violations and to determine appropriate sanctions. The phrasing was deliciously pompous, like a medieval court summons dressed up in corporate legalese. But what really caught my attention was the date, 3 days from now. They weren't wasting time, which told me one thing. My cookout had hit them harder than I realized. I could have ignored the notice entirely. Legally, the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property, which made their summons about as binding as a party invitation from a stranger. But ignoring them would let them spin the story their way. No, I decided I'd attend, and I'd bring something they weren't expecting. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Clint and I pored over every map, survey, and deed in my growing arsenal. We organized them into a neat binder, each page labeled and tabbed like a prosecutor's dream file. We weren't just going to defend ourselves. We were going to put the HOA on trial in their own clubhouse. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's mood shifted from cautious curiosity to open support. Ellen, the retired teacher, baked cookies for luck. A guy from 2 streets over offered to haul in folding chairs so everyone who wanted to watch the show could fit. I didn't invite them. I didn't have to. Word was spreading, and by the day of the hearing, I had a silent army ready to walk in behind me. When the afternoon came, we marched over to the clubhouse like it was the set of a courtroom drama. The place had been staged for intimidation. Long table at the front, 5 board members sitting stiff and self-important, Marlene dead center like a queen on her throne. To her right, Ted lounged in his chair, arms crossed, trying to look menacing. "Mr. Lawson," Marlene began, "thank you for attending on such short notice. This hearing concerns multiple violations." "Actually," I interrupted, sliding my binder onto the table, "this hearing concerns something far more important, the fact that this HOA has been enforcing rules on property it doesn't own." A ripple moved through the room. Marlene's eyes narrowed. "We have the authority granted by our charter." "Which," I said, flipping open to the first map, "does not extend to my land. Or the tennis courts. Or the pool. Or, frankly, about 20% of the common areas you've been charging people to maintain." Clint handed copies of the relevant plats to each board member. I could see the color drain from Ted's face as he traced the bright yellow boundary lines. "This is absurd," Marlene snapped, but her voice wavered. "These are old surveys." "They're from the county records, dated and certified," I said. "And they've been on file for decades. You've been collecting fees and issuing fines on land you have no legal right to control. That's not just overreach, that's fraud." Behind me, someone stifled a laugh. Another whispered, "Oh, she's done for." Marlene tried to regain control, straightening her papers. "Regardless, your barbecue pit violates the community's aesthetic standards. Which," I said calmly, "do not apply to my property. And until you fix your own legal mess, I'd advise you to stop threatening me or anyone else here with baseless fines." Silence settled over the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Ted shifted uncomfortably. Only Marlene held her ground, though her knuckles were white against the tabletop. "You've made your point," she said finally. "We'll review the documentation." "That's good," I replied, standing. "Because if you don't, my next stop is the county attorney's office, and after that, the local paper." I didn't wait for a dismissal. I turned and walked out, my neighbors following like a victorious parade. Once outside, the tension broke. People clapped me on the back, others hugged me, and Ellen pressed another bag of cookies into my hands. But Clint pulled me aside. "That wasn't the end," he warned. "She's not going to let this go. People like Marlene, they double down when they're cornered." I knew he was right. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about control. And Marlene, for all her smugness, had just been told she wasn't queen of the castle after all. The next morning, my prediction came true. A letter from the HOA's attorney appeared in my mailbox, filled with threats about potential litigation and community disruption. They were escalating, trying to scare me into backing down. But fear wasn't part of my plan. I had the law on my side and the community behind me. And now, with their legal overreach exposed, I had a chance to push even further, maybe even dismantle some of their power entirely. So I made a decision. I wouldn't just defend my barbecue pit. I'd launch a full-scale challenge to the HOA's authority, using their own mistakes as leverage. If they wanted to draw a line in the sand, I'd cross it, and then I'd drag it right into their clubhouse. By now, the battle lines were drawn so clearly you could have painted them on the street in neon spray paint. On one side, me, armed with dusty deeds, county records, and a barbecue pit that had become a neighborhood icon. On the other, Marlene and her HOA board, clutching their laminated bylaws like holy scripture and pretending they still had the upper hand. The attorney's letter they'd sent me was textbook intimidation, paragraphs of legal jargon designed to sound ominous, but so vague it could apply to just about anything. I read it twice, laughed once, and then slid it into a folder labeled Evidence. Because that's what it was now. Evidence. Every overreach, every threat, every pompous declaration they'd made was part of the case I was building. Not in court. At least not yet, but in the court of public opinion, which, in a small community like ours, could be just as damning. Clint and I decided the next move wasn't to respond directly to the HOA's attorney. That's exactly what they wanted, a back and forth they could drag on for months. Instead, we'd go public. Not on social media. I wasn't about to start a digital shouting match, but right here on the HOA's own turf. It started with a flyer. Bright yellow, bold black letters. Who really owns our neighborhood? Underneath was a simple map, the same one from the county records, highlighting all the areas the HOA had no legal claim over. No accusations, no insults, just facts. At the bottom, copies of the official documents available at the clubhouse this Saturday, 2 p.m. We printed a few hundred and slipped them into every mailbox. By the next morning, the whispers had turned into full-blown conversations on front porches, at the park, even at the coffee stand by the entrance gate. People weren't just curious, they were angry. Saturday came, and the clubhouse parking lot was overflowing. Inside, Clint and I set up a neat display, enlarged maps on easels, copies of the deeds stacked in piles, and a timeline showing exactly how the HOA had been operating beyond its authority for decades. At 2 o'clock sharp, I stood up front and laid it out. The documents. The property lines. The fact that nearly a quarter of the HOA's jurisdiction was an illusion. The barbecue pit was just the tip of the iceberg. You could see the realization spreading through the crowd like wildfire. People were flipping through the papers, tracing the maps with their fingers, murmuring to each other. And then the questions started. Not for me, for the board members who had shown up to defend themselves. Marlene was there, of course, flanked by Ted and 2 other board members. They tried to push back, claiming it was an old paperwork discrepancy, that nothing would really change, but the crowd wasn't buying it. "What about the tennis courts?" one woman demanded. "Are you refunding the fees we've been paying for land you don't own?" a man shouted from the back. Marlene's composure was cracking. Her voice got sharper, her answers shorter. Ted kept trying to interject, but every time he did, someone cut him off with another question. It was the first time I'd ever seen the board on defense, and it was glorious. When it was over, I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. The seed had been planted, and the community was already rallying. People were talking about audits, about electing new board members, about demanding accountability. My personal war over a barbecue pit had turned into a neighborhood-wide rebellion. But I still had one more move. 2 days later, I walked into the HOA's management office with a single envelope. Inside was a certified letter, addressed to the board, formally revoking their right to access, use, or maintain any portion of my property, including the pool, the tennis courts, and the path behind the clubhouse. See, when you own the deed to the land under those common areas, you get to decide who can step on it. And while I wasn't planning to chain the gates shut, the possibility alone was enough to send shockwaves through their little empire. The next board meeting was chaos. Attendance had tripled, and the first 30 minutes were nothing but residents demanding explanations. Marlene tried to spin it, claiming I was holding the neighborhood hostage, but by now, too many people knew the truth. They weren't mad at me, they were mad at her. One by one, neighbors stood up and called for her resignation. Ted tried to defend her, but his voice was drowned out by a chorus of frustration. Someone even brought up the time he'd fined a widow for having unauthorized lawn ornaments. That didn't help his case. By the end of the meeting, Marlene wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't even making eye contact. And when the vote came, a motion to remove her as president, it passed by a landslide. Just like that, the woman who had threatened me over a barbecue pit was out of power. Ted followed 2 weeks later after a recall petition gained more than enough signatures. In their place, the community elected a new board, one that promised transparency, fairness, and, most importantly, to stay within the actual boundaries of their authority. The first order of business? Officially acknowledging that my property, and several others, were outside HOA jurisdiction. The second, ending the ridiculous fine system that had been draining wallets for years. When the meeting adjourned, I walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, the scent of grilled ribs still lingering from the celebratory cookout I'd hosted earlier that afternoon. My barbecue pit sat in its rightful place, flames crackling, neighbors laughing around it. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about watching a community take back its power. And all it took was a little research, a lot of stubbornness, and the willingness to push back when someone tried to overstep. Marlene hasn't spoken to me since. She still lives here, though she keeps to herself now. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of her walking past, eyes fixed straight ahead, pretending not to notice the smoke curling up from my grill. And every time, I can't help but smile. You'd think that once Marlene was ousted and Ted had been shown the door, life in the neighborhood would return to quiet suburban bliss. And for a while, it did. The lawns were still neat, the mailboxes still matched, and the pool still had that faint smell of chlorine and sunscreen. But beneath it all, there was something new, a sense of freedom, like the air itself was lighter. The new board wasted no time rewriting the rules, trimming down the bloated HOA handbook to a slim, sensible list that actually made sense. No more fines for hanging a wreath too early. No more approval forms for planting flowers. And certainly no more aesthetic violations for harmless things like barbecue pits. My pit, in fact, became something of a local landmark. The board even asked if I'd be willing to host an annual neighborhood cook-off in my backyard. The first year we did it, half the neighborhood showed up. The second year, it was everyone. Even folks from the next community over came by, bringing coolers, side dishes, and stories of their own run-ins with petty HOA boards. It was funny. What had started as a targeted attack to shut me down ended up creating a tradition that brought people closer together. Kids ran through sprinklers, couples danced barefoot in the grass, and the grill never stopped smoking until well past midnight. But there was one more matter I hadn't quite settled, the property deed itself. 4 months, I'd kept the original documents in a safe deposit box, pulling them out only when needed. But now, with the board reformed and the community united, I didn't want to wield that deed like a weapon anymore. It was leverage, sure, but it was also a responsibility. So I made a choice. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in with a folder under my arm. The new board president, a soft-spoken retired firefighter named Jim, looked up from his notes and smiled. "Evening," he said. I nodded and took my seat until the open floor portion came up. Then I stood, holding the folder high enough for everyone to see. "This," I said, "is the original property deed for the land under your clubhouse, pool, tennis courts, and a few other spots you've been using for decades. Legally, it's mine. But I'm here tonight to change that." You could feel the tension in the room. People knew the history, knew the fights, knew the way that document had appended everything. "I'm not giving it back to the old board," I continued. "They abused their authority and tried to bully people into submission. But this new board, you've proven you're here for the right reasons. So I'm transferring the deed, with one condition." A murmur swept through the crowd. Jim leaned forward. "What's the condition?" "That this HOA," I said, "will never again exceed its legal authority. No more fake fines. No more fabricated rules. You stick to the law, and you stick to fairness. You break that promise, and this deed reverts back to me." Jim stood, walked over, and extended his hand. "You have my word," he said. And judging by the applause that followed, he had the community's word, too. We signed the transfer right there, in front of everyone. It felt right. Like closing a chapter that had dragged on too long. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood blossomed. Not just with flowers and tidy lawns, but with genuine friendliness. People waved more. Conversations lasted longer. There was less suspicion, less gossip. We'd been through the fire together, literally and figuratively, and come out stronger. As for Marlene, she kept her head down. Rumor had it she was trying to join another HOA board in a different development, but word of her antics had spread further than she thought. I heard through the grapevine that her application was politely declined. Ted moved away entirely. Last I saw of him was a for sale sign on his lawn and a moving truck in his driveway. No one threw him a goodbye party. One warm evening, months after it all had settled, I found myself sitting by the barbecue pit, the embers glowing red against the dark. Clint dropped by, carrying a six-pack, and sat down beside me. "You ever think," he said, "that this all started over a couple of burgers?" I laughed. Burgers, ribs, and a stubborn streak. He nodded toward the houses around us, lights twinkling in the windows. "Worth it, though." I took a slow sip from my beer and smiled. "Every bit of it." We sat there in companionable silence, the smell of smoke and grilled meat drifting into the night, the sound of distant laughter carrying on the breeze. The war with the HOA was over. The neighborhood was ours again, in every sense of the word. And as long as the pit kept burning, so would the spirit that had brought us together.